1.5 to 2 degrees is not a point of system stability. And the reason for that is obvious, and it's before our eyes right now, and that is that so many carbon cycles are now out of sync. And whether it's forest, whether it's permafrost, whether it's boreal forest, whether it's retreating ice sheets changing the reflectivity of the planet, 1.5 to 2 is not a point of system stability. You're either going to end up at 3 or you're going to have to cool back to 0.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I speak with climate policy analyst and research director at the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, David Spratt. He has recently published a report titled "Warming has reached 1.5 degrees C. What does that mean for climate advocacy?" David offers his perspective on climate policy through the Australian lens as the Earth heats to 1.5 degrees, with no end in sight for the damage that it is causing to human life, nature and infrastructure. The link to the paper is in the notes. In the members area, I am just uploading an interview with Mark Maslin, Professor of Earth System Science at University College London. This was recorded just after the release of the World Meteorological Society report on climate, published 2 months ago. I explore the findings with Mark, in which he stresses that cleaner air due to reduced industrial pollution is revealing the planet's true warming trajectory, while ocean heat content is compounding the climate system's feedback loops. With so much global discussion around defense, war and amassing hard power, I will also be speaking with Erin Sikorsky, Director of the Centre for Climate and Security and also the Director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Erin's new book, Climate Change on the Battlefield, International Military Responses to the Climate Crisis, is poignant at a time when the effects of climate change are arguably the greatest collective international security threat on Earth today. I will be uploading more interviews to the members area this week, including an interview about die-off of marine ecosystems along the Galician coast with Dr. Guillermo Diaz from Santiago University, who is also thinking about what to do to preserve ecosystems and with it, the local fishing industries and way of life. Thank you to all existing and new subscribers for supporting this ClimateGenn project. David, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much for taking the time. There's a technical discussion at the moment of whether we've officially reached the 1.5 degrees C global mean temperature. A key feature of this discussion is acceleration. And I just wanted to ask you, what does acceleration look like from a sort of Australian perspective?
The global figures are that the rate of warming has accelerated 50% from 30 years ago of 0.2 per decade to 0.3. So things are quickening up. In Australia, what made me really think about 1.5 is that we have these floods which are enormous and break all records. And, we had a town where 500 houses are basically lost. It's a town that my parents come from, so I know a little bit. And they say, this was a 1 in 500 year event. And then a year or 2 years later, it happens again. And they say, it's another 1 in 105 year event. And I mean, what that points to is that the understanding of the risks is too conservative. Either they're using out of date flood maps, or they're using an understanding of the risk which is not up with reality. And we had a flood expert recently from Queensland come and say the maps are out of date. And that's why floods, and it's the same in Europe. You get heat waves and they go, this is 1 in 100 years. And then it happens again. So this points to a systemic problem with the underestimation of the risks. And I think a failure to anticipate two things. The first is that warming is happening faster than expected. And the second is that the extremes at that level of warming are greater than the models represent. And, we've had a lot of people, Michael Mann and many others, say that the models can't represent everything. This idea of Rossby waves, which is really new in the Arctic, that are really helping to jam the heat that you're experiencing now. So this is the problem, that in essence, our risk management is living in a past paradigm. This is not the only example. In 2010, we had some fires which were called Black Saturday, an incredible heat wave. Several hundred people died in the fires. I think another 300 died from heat during that period. And it was said that the intensity of those fires was such that was not expected until the end of the century. So this is I guess Jason Box coined the phrase faster than forecast. This is just more expressions of this phenomenon.
And when you're talking about how these are presented through the media to the population, and then you talk about how that is interpreted by policymakers, can you give a nutshell of how are Australian policymakers responding to these challenges?
In a word, they're not. I mean, we have had a climate risk assessment, the first in Australia that's been undertaken. It was started almost 3 years ago, and 2 years ago, we have a Senate, and the Senate have estimates where you can get senior people from the departments to come and answer questions. And they asked the people in charge of the risk assessment what was their assessment of warming for 2050? What was the scenario they were using? And they said, oh, 1.5 to 2 degrees by 2050. And the senators who from the Greens party said, well, that's just out of date. And so, as I understand it, the people doing the risk assessment then went away and said, we will do a risk assessment with various temperatures, but we won't put a timeline on it. So if you don't have a timeline on when it's going to get too hot, then you can't plan any policy because you've just abnegated responsibility. So this is the problem that's being expressed again now, because we've got 1.5 degrees now. I mean, that's clear. We've got a new paper from Stefan Ramsdorf and Foster looking at 5 data sets and statistically analysing it. One of the data sets said we've hit 1.5 in 2024. The other 4 say 2026. Jim Hansen says we're there now. I mean, yes, we're there at 1.5. And policymakers are still basing their work on the old IPCC 2018 report, which said on average we won't beat to 1.5 to 2040. The IPCC says 2040. The risk analysis, the mitigation, the emergency management, policy is based on 1.5 2040, and we're there now. So, I mean, my quick take is that 15 years has just been taken out of the mitigation timetable. We have just lost 15 years. 1.5 is here 15 years faster than policymakers thought it would be.
Let's come back to this very point, but I want to just quickly touch on root causes. And we know that it's global emissions, and you've written about this. The current sort of snapshot of global emissions isn't like you just said, we've lost 15 years on mitigation time, but we've also wasted more time in trying to tackle emissions. What's the current outlook?
The evidence is that emissions are still going up. They have not yet peaked. And people are saying next year, and maybe it will be, but they've been saying that for 10 years. I remember in 2010 when that was the critical decade, and we're another critical decade, and we're halfway through. So what's happening is that renewable energy is adding to the fossil fuel energy supply rather than replacing it. Or in other words, the increasing demand for electricity from India, from China, from AI, from crypto, from cloud services, the increasing demand for energy is greater than the rate at which renewables are going out. So emissions are still going up. We have new information, new research coming out saying what's called the Earth's energy imbalance, which is the difference between incoming and outgoing heat. And it really talks about, how much more heat is in the system. Earth's energy imbalance has doubled in the last 20 years, faster than the models. So that suggests that there's a lot more heat to come, more than the modelling and the policymakers expect. So from those point of views, and the question of aerosols, that the fact that we're losing cooling, which has really been the drive of this rapid heat, would suggest that this accelerated rate of warming, which is now about zero point 0.3 per decade, will go on for the next 2 or 3 decades.
You just stressed, I mean, if you take all those factors together and where they put us on the sort of risk slider, and you talked about last decade was a critical decade, this decade is a critical decade, And I'm paraphrasing something I read in your work about how close do you want to stand to the cliff in terms
Yes.
of what is acceptable risk? I mean,
Well,
what seems to be our collective response to this idea of acceptable risk at the moment?
this is the problem from two points of view. First of all, from a risk management point of view, if a risk is really severe, I mean, we can call it existential, but even if it's the chance of a bridge falling down or a plane crashing, you want to know what the plausible worst case scenario is. What's the worst thing that could happen that could crash the plane or whatever, crash the climate? But policymakers and the science that feeds them, particularly the IPCC reports, doesn't look at the worst case scenarios, it looks at the middle range. So that's the first problem, that we're not looking at the most damaging possibilities, which is why these 1 in 500 year floods turn out to be 1 in 3. So I think that's the problem. The second problem is when we're making policy, what's driving us? What's the normative goal? So we used to have this thing about avoiding dangerous anthropogenic influence in the climate system, on which the UNFCCC started, and that was said to be 2 degrees by an economist, not by scientists or people affected, by an economist. And then people said, no, it's probably 1.5. And in fact, Sir David King, who worked with the small island states in Paris, where that was put up, after that Paris meeting, gave an interview and he said, I was wrong. I realised that 1.5 was too high. And that's now clear because we've had a number of papers this year saying at 1.5, systems will have tipped. You've done interviews on AMOC, you've done interviews on the Amazon, which is tipping right now. I mean, Jason Bock says effectively Greenland has passed its tipping point. Eric Rigno said that about West Antarctica in 2014. Wherever you go, I mean, coral reefs and the death spiral, I mean, 1.5 is not what I would call a safe or reasonable target. So the question I've been asking is, why do policymakers and even NGOs keep on talking about 1.5 when it's at the edge of the precipice? It's like, how close can we go without burning all the ecosystems? Rather than the question of what would we need to do to actually preserve them. So I think we're tipping very close in the black hole to that point where you disappear, the
Yeah.
horizon event.
Well, I think you just answered my last two questions all in one
Oh,
go. So I'm gonna.
sorry.
No, that's okay. That's good because we can accelerate. Um, yeah, and you mentioned COP21, and we talked then a lot, and a lot of people. I remember even Caroline Lucas, the Green MP at the time. When I interviewed her, she said, there's a huge disconnect between what the science is telling us and policy making. How do we address this? Because policy goal setting is like a fantasy area, and scientific realities are arriving so fast and impacting us so fast. We're in a
Well,
really awkward position.
in the fossil fuel industry, there's COP, and we know what it's going to do, and governments are into the art of a compromise and a deal, and we know what that ends up with. I mean, as I said many years ago, trying to negotiate with the laws of physics and chemistry is a dumb thing to do because they'll just walk all over you. What worries me is that those people from NGOs, from the climate activism, climate concern point of view. I mean, for example, in Paris, when 1.5 was put up there, we'd already had Bill McKibben's 350.org movement. And Jim Hansen had said, and that was what Bill McKibben based his work on, Jim Hansen said, what's safe is under 350, under 1 degree. And in fact, we know now it's probably closer to zero point 0.5. So, I mean, my question is, why did advocates and NGOs go along to Paris and say 1.5? Fabulous, just what we need. That's a great step forward, rather than saying 1.5 won't save ecosystems. So, I mean, I think it's the climate movement, the climate advocates who have, with a lack of understanding of the science or in this urge to be inside the tent and be a player, are agreeing to compromises which negate the scientific realities.
I did speak to the late Dr. Salim ul Haq about this, and he was part of a group of vulnerable nations who were arguing very strongly for 1.5 because
Mm,
the Paris Agreement was going to put in 2 degrees, and he said
mm,
they knew it was extremely difficult for them to try just hold to that. But because 2 degrees was a death sentence, it had to give them something to fight for. And
But 1.5 is a death sentence too.
yeah, I know, but every time we move the target higher,
Mm,
we relax in that space, expecting to overshoot it. So it's kind of a crazy situation. And now you fast forward to today, where all climate action is being reneged on, and you've written about this
mm,
as well. And this is by policymakers and industry
mm,
and the financial sector, etc., etc. And it's being displaced by a whole, instead of era of climate, we're talking about an era of violence. And
mm.
through all of that, do you see a pathway back to a sane and safer destination? We're talking about biodiversity, ecosystems, we're talking about future
Mm,
generations,
mm.
for all of that.
Emissions are going up. The fossil fuel industry is on the attack. Policymakers are on the retreat. That's what you've just said. That's clear. So what's the discussion from here on in? I think our side needs absolute clarity. I mean, for example, you see a lot of advocacy about 1.5, keeping 1.5 alive. Yes, we're at 1.5 now, and they say yes, 1.5 plus overshoot and come back to 2100. I'm not sure that those people understand that that overshoot might be 1 degree. At their rate, I mean, in another 3 decades, we could go up another degree and then come back down. I mean, if in that overshoot you kill off a whole lot of ecosystems, cooling down won't bring the ecosystems back. So I don't think there's a clear understanding that overshoot has its problem. The other thing, and this is a sort of a more scientific argument, is that I think a lot of people on all sides assume that 1.5 is an endpoint. Yes, we get the 1.5, everything will be okay. And Jim Hansen and paleoclimatologists have made this point for a long time. There are points of stability in the system and there are points of instability. We know over the last million years, the climate has seesawed between glacials, 3 or 4 degrees warmer, 180 parts per million, and interglacials, the Holocene, what we've experienced. But there's not a point of stability in between. Jim Hansen has made the point over and over again that 1.5 to 2 degrees is not a point of system stability. And the reason for that is obvious, and it's before our eyes right now, and that is that so many carbon cycles are now out of sync. And whether it's forest, whether it's permafrost, whether it's boreal forest, whether it's retreating ice sheets changing the reflectivity of the planet, 1.5 to 2 is not a point of system stability. You're either going to end up at 3 or you're going to have to cool back to 0. I mean, I say 1.5 is a signpost on a dusty road. It's not a place. And I don't think policymakers or advocates have thought about that. And that, of course, then takes you to the quest of climate interventions. And you've recently been at a conference talking about that a lot. I mean, I think I won't say the good news, but I think it's interesting that a lot of people are now talking about the need for climate interventions and cooling until fast mitigation and drawdown can get the system back in order, that we need to try and pull the heat down for a short term. I think the cooling agenda is really opening up, and people who were previously openly opposed to what they call geoengineering are now realizing that it may be the least worst option. So I think that's where the debate has moved on.
If we just take what you said about, we're potentially going to keep going to a whole degree of overshoot.
Mm,
And there's a
mm,
lot of dialogue. I know that there's a tipping points conference going on, and we just had the Arctic Repair Conference that I attended, and the people talking about the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional
yes.
Overturning Circulation, the ocean currents that transport heat around and keep the world as we know it climatically. That's potentially slowing down and stopping, which would transform global climate. And yet, when they analyze the impacts of climate intervention, so if you did stratospheric aerosol
Mm,
injection,
mm,
for example, so you pump stuff up to try and cool down, you really got to start 5 years ago because of
mm,
the whole processes involved. I couldn't repeat the science to you, but
yeah, yeah.
as you go further down this road and closer to it tipping, if it actually tips, the recent research seems to indicate if you tried to cool, then you could actually cause a massive advance of ice sheets down to southern England.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah. So,
there's loads of stuff around that which you
well,
can
look,
pick apart.
I think there are two issues there. First of all, coming back to this question of overshoot and getting in too late. There's this thing which I won't try and explain in detail called hysteresis, which basically says the path from A to B is not the same path from B back to A. That is, for example, if you melt an ice sheet or slow down an AMOC, that can happen really quickly in 100, 200 years, very quickly in historical terms. But the path back is really slow. I remember talking to Antarctic scientists saying, we think that the tipping point for the really vulnerable Antarctic glaciers was around zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.8 of a degree, looking back. But they said you might have to get back to zero to refreeze it. So this idea of overshoot and being able to just, open the blind and everything will be all right again. This is a problem. Overshoot, because of hysteresis and other things, makes it a very complicated question. And the second issue you refer to is something that I think Mike McCracken, I don't know whether he talked about in your recent interview with him. He said there's this view that climate interventions, sulfate, cooling the planet is something that we'll do when everything else has failed. When we've got to 2.5 or 3 degrees. But he said at 2.5 or 3 degrees, it probably won't work because the problem is too big. He said you need to start testing this early. He says at 1.5 degrees, it might work. At 2.5 or 3, it won't. And that's the issue. And I think that's parallel to the AMOC story that you were telling, that waiting things get bad and thinking some magic bullet will reverse it is not going to happen.
That brings us to this sort of coming back to this idea of the message, because
Mm,
at the moment there's a polarization in this whole discussion around climate interventions. And there are a lot of emerging voices. At that conference, I did speak to someone from the Sami Council. I spoke to someone who from Tuvalu, and both for the lady from Tuvalu, who from the climate representative, was deeply upset about the consequences of sea level rise and inundation, and basically the destruction of their identity, culture, and actual land. And when I asked, would you consider intervention like the being proposed at the conference, she said she was an emphatic yes. And then the
mm.
Sami Council very famously opposed the Scopex
Yes.
experiment and have responded since then by setting up a council looking at individual
Mm,
proposals and trying to educate themselves about all of the proposals that could potentially
mm.
help their communities because they are so badly impacted. And it seems like we have people who are on the front lines of climate change really being more open to these
Mm.
discussions than a lot of scientists who might, be much more involved in the arguments as opposed to the sort of
Mm.
out there. What do you think about this polarization and how it could be diffused a bit?
Well, I think that's very encouraging. I think this 1.5 degrees actually happening 15 years earlier than anybody felt, which has increased the pressure on everybody, policymakers, activists. It's sort of mugged people. This is shock. This is real shock and awe, something we didn't expect for 2040s now. And so people are prepared to rethink, to have another look at things. And the problem with the debate about climate interventions, it's been, there's been several aspects. The first is particularly, well, some scientists, but scientists have often been very bad political operators. So I excuse that, good scientists, not necessarily good philosophers. There's been this view that we shouldn't interfere with nature, what we call the conservation, paradigm. But the fact is, we have interfered with nature so badly now that the world's major ecosystems are on the point of collapse. So you shouldn't interfere with nature, solar sulfates or climate interventions interfering with nature. Not interfering with nature won't save nature. So I think the conservation paradox argument is now completely out of date. The second thing is that people say, we've got this situation. If you do sulfates, there could be some bad outcomes, but that's the wrong comparison. The comparison is not now versus doing sulfates. The comparison is doing sulfates or what the world will look like in 20 years without sulfates. And if we get to 2 or 2.5 degrees, the famous hothouse Earth paper with Will Steffen and so on said the tipping point for the hothouse Earth runaway extended warming beyond human capacity to rein in is between 1.5 to 2. We're moving into that zone now. So the efficacy of climate intervention should be compared with the hothouse possibility, not with the current circumstances. And the third thing is, and which I think your interviewer is probably referred to, is we are now in a least worst choice outcome. I mean, yes, in the perfect world, there wouldn't have been climate change and nature would be happy and we'd be all happy. But we are at the point of systemic collapse, both of human systems and of nature. And the question is, what is the least worst outcome? And I personally think that trying to bring some cooling into the system to stop the AMOC slowing so that you can't grow food in northwestern Europe and the UK is probably a thing that needs to be really thought about. So I think the fact that policymakers have been mugged by this new 1.5 reality opens up a whole lot of possibilities in the climate intervention space. And I think the opposition will drift away in a sense. I mean, I'm told that there's a lot of scientists who publicly sit on their hands who privately are saying this is necessary. I know a few years ago, as a person did a thesis in Melbourne and interviewed 15 people about their attitudes to interventions, and they included some leaders of some NGOs, some climate organisations, whose public position was opposition and who privately said it was necessary. So I think if we can draw this out, I think that's really important.
I know in the past you've done quite a lot of work on the idea of defense. How does this kind of climate area fit into the defense narrative? And yet, on the more broader stage right now, countries are actually spending way above what they were spending before on defense budgets, but on conflicts to fight each other. How have you reflected on this?
We could do a whole program on the idea of security because as soon as you say national security, people think, marching to war and uniforms and tanks and so on. If you talk about human security, the right of people to live, to have food and water, and so on. They're both securities, but they're different understandings of security. And I think this is the choice that has to be made. I mean, we in Australia have signed a new defence agreement with the United States for nuclear submarines. That means that if the United States goes to war with China, we will be involved. And I do work with some former military people who tell me in every war game of a China-US war, in every war game that's been held, the Chinese have won and the US have lost. So this is madness. This is madness. And some of the security leaders here are saying climate, not China, is the biggest threat. This is human security, not old-fashioned national security. So I think there is a debate about security. I mean, security, safety. I mean, I don't know whether it was Lincoln, whoever said the first duty of a government is to protect the people. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So I think security can have a different turn. That might seem idealistic, but I think there has to be some really forthright discussions. And we have here in Australia former prime ministers saying, no, not more money for this stuff. Let's deal with the real issues. So, I mean, that's got to be had out as well. But the trend is not good in terms of this securitization of climate. And we've seen in the UK, I think, climate adaptation money being switched into defence.
This seems insane when we know that we're committed to certain levels of sea level rise and the amount of GDP that it will consume to move those cities that will build the defence infrastructure, and we're wasting it all on bullets.
As you know, a long time ago, we did some work and we talked about the need for emergency action or a mobilization. I mean, and the analogy in a way was the war economy. In Second World War, most of the Allies spent 35% of their economy on the war. The COVID response was another thing. We dropped a lot of things we were doing, and governments did special things to deal with the problem. Climate is a far greater problem than any of those. And I think it's a bit like the least worst outcome argument. The notion that we can go along in some business as usual mode and deal with this is absurd. This is all hands on deck. I mean, really, with the 1.5 mugging, this is now all hands on deck. And I think climate advocates, large and small, should say that. Say, let's not pretend this is normal. We can go to a conference and we'll put on a tax and the market will solve this. None of that's true. Any more than 1.5 is stable. This is, I mean, I think we need a bit of nitty-gritty realism about the threat.
That's a very, very good place to conclude, and it would be good to come back and talk some more about this idea of defense because it actually crosses over with adaptation and where the money should go and what we're actually doing to, and it is about envisioning a future because a lot of people are disconnecting thoughts from the future and living in a sort of tormented present, and I think that's very unhealthy. So
Thank you, Nick.
if you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.